Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I usually identify this as a BookTube, but that's not the case today. We are going to be talking about a film, and through this film, two other films. Now, you might not be as interested or as invested in the Alien franchise as I have been, as a lot of folks are in the science fiction universe, but I assure you that in the course of this conversation, because we're not treating this as a traditional film review, there should absolutely be lessons for craft, whether you are a writer of science fiction in general, maybe leaning into horror, even if you enjoy action, because I think there is a lot to say through this latest piece, Alien Romulus, about the work that goes into creating these kinds of stories, for better and for worse, the tensions that emerge when priorities are different, when audience expectations are different, when you have the weight of canon behind you. There's so much that we're going to be talking about today. I have to introduce, as always, my special guest, The Highway. It's actually going to matter today. Well, I mean, it always matters. Sometimes I'm interrupted by trucks, motorcycles, occasionally macaws, dogs, children. That's pretty much the run of it. Oh, a helicopter every now and then. But keep in mind the idea that I am speaking to you from a context, a material context, when we talk about setting in relation to these films. So there is definitely always something to be done with whatever context one is working with. It doesn't have to necessarily be a downside. It can be turned into something constructive. I have so many notes, but I want to clarify before we get started the overall framework of what we're going to be doing today. I feel this is necessary because I'm talking about a film that only came out a couple weeks ago. Maybe not everyone has had a chance to see it. So I'm going to clarify. I am going to give spoilers about Alien and Prometheus because there has been time. You've had time to watch those if you wanted to. But for Alien Romulus, I'm going to split up my commentary into some spoiler-free analysis on craft and then some lessons in craft that require spoilers. So I'll mark those all in the video notes, which means that you can skip ahead if you want to see it first. Myself, personally, I sometimes prefer waiting to watch a film myself before listening to other people's commentary. And yet, again, this is not supposed to really be a film review per se. It is supposed to be an analysis. So we're going to be talking about Alien. We're going to be talking about Prometheus. We're going to be talking about Álvarez, Fede Álvarez, who's the director of Alien Romulus. And then we're going to move into Alien Romulus, the spoiler-free zone, and then the zone with spoilers. And hopefully, even if you don't stay to the end, there will be lots for you to take away and think about in your own practice. I'm also going to emphasize everyone has a subject position. There's no such thing as an objective read on films. And it's usually better to know what the subject position of the person who's speaking is. So I really quite enjoyed Alien Romulus. I would say that next to Alien and Aliens, it's my third favorite in the series now. I have only seen it once. I've seen Alien many times, and Aliens as well. The first four films, I had the quadrilogy, so we would watch those quite often. Back in the VHS era, you just had home videos and you put on whatever you already had, so as many times as it took. There's a kind of ritual in that. I am not a fan of Prometheus and Covenant for films for reasons that we will talk about. But it's amazing that quite a few of us really do not like those films. There are diehards who quite enjoy those films. We're going to be talking about the audience shift. I'm going to have strong feelings, and to give you a sense of how strong my feelings are, I came out of Prometheus so angry that I went and for the next 3 days, amid other things, I had a life. I rewrote the screenplay using the same elements because I was just so upset with it that I wanted to prove to myself that it could have been better with the same elements. And that's because Ridley Scott is a director who very much thrives on a cinematographic level, but sometimes really needs like a good screenwriter to rein in some of those ideas or to give voice to certain ideas. But we'll get into that later. I just want to give you a sense of my positioning as we go into this. So we're going to start with, well, yes, the main moral of the story for today is that you're never going to please everybody, but this film, to me, Alien Romulus, did work that was extremely necessary to demonstrate a return to form, a return to control, an acknowledgement and an awareness of what made the originals work. And why this was so refreshing to me is because often what happens with a franchise is it unspools and unravels until it becomes inconsistent. So much heaped upon narrative and canon sometimes makes for incoherence. And sometimes people are fine with incoherence. It's a kind of dribbling off of the narrative. But there's something really lovely about a film that feels like a declaration of, we know what made the first ones work, and we are still in our day and age with increased CGI, with increased capabilities, with larger budgets in many regards, interested in and capable of achieving that vision again. This is especially important because the film is preceding the launch of an Alien TV series, which again has a showrunner who's very emphatic about wanting to return to the original, the retrofuturism of the original. We're going to be talking about this throughout this episode, but the reason that this matters, some people always want something new, even if what's new ends up burnishing or messing with the old in terms of making it incoherent. They just want something novel. But narrative structures through our history, I hate to sound like a high school essay, since the beginning of time, our narrative structures often have repetition and a return to certain familiar tropes built into them. That's necessary, that's important, those are touchstones. And it's pay attention a little bit to when people expect novelty or dismiss the use of tropes, because they might be extremely selective about what they are complaining about. In our culture, we're surrounded by heavy-handed tropes. I mean, oh no, nobody does anything really that different for instance, most religious rituals all throughout the year, because those are core tropes. And we as a species, we turn back to them, we touch base with them, because they have a strong sense of familiarity that allows us to reflect on variability. So tropes are not a bad thing. Tropes are necessary. And this series, the franchise in its first two films, established a huge body of tropes that could be built upon and negotiated, revisited, without it necessarily being a bad thing. So pay attention to when somebody just says, oh, if it's not new, if it's not novel, if it's not flashy, if it doesn't create something that's extravagantly different from the old, it must be bad. Really think about the work that we're doing in all our genres, fairy tale structures, religious structures in our society, Bollywood. Usually it's the same bloody story played out a million ways, but it works because variation on a theme is that lovely tension in storytelling. The trope and then the variation. We expect certain familiar elements, we expect certain beats, and we delight in the variations that are added to them. So that's my opening spiel. We're going to go back to the original. Let's go back to Alien to start us off. Alien is one of my favorite films, and so I'm going to be extremely passionate about this. 1979, we have to remember too, is a very different cultural moment, and there are some elements of the film that I'm not going to talk about today here. They're going to be in my newsletter on Monday, where I talk a lot about the representations of labor, because that was something extremely novel when Alien came out, and other films would come after and lean on that aesthetic. But before then, a lot of films focused on exceptionalism in space. And then here you have this motley crew, just an everyday working class crew. And there was something really fresh and invigorating about that. And it did, again, we'll go into that in the piece tomorrow, but it does a lot of work for building character. It really fleshes out the individual stories, which is important. But there are other really wonderful components of this film that mean that it continues to stand the test of time. It is now 45 years old. I can't believe that. It's shocking. But it has set a huge standard for some reasons that are important as the baseline for our craft discussion. So let's go through some of them. I hope I don't have to explain the plot necessarily of Alien to anyone. I'm not going to. We start the way that really good action films and horror films, I'm not saying this has to be absolutely every single one of them, but action films, horror films, and good science fiction films tend to make use of this important aspect of storytelling. They build setting as a character. And that is something that Alien does right from the opening. We open with the ship waking up. We move through the ship waking up. We learn the different sections of the ship while it is waking up. So Mother has gotten a message and the crew has to be awoken earlier. They're not expecting it. And then, of course, there's going to be all kinds of drama that unfolds because of that choice. But what this does, this staging, allows us to see where future action is going to take place. We are establishing for the viewer or the reader, if you're writing a story similarly, the location, the expectations, what is familiar, what is normative. And then with that, you can build on it. So we are establishing a very clear spatial awareness of what is going on. From this, we then introduce the characters as fully formed people who are in the middle of their own stories already. And that is extremely important to good storytelling. Sometimes a film will not bother to give or story two, the reader or viewer a sense that the characters already have lived in worlds because it's not the point. They're just trying to put bodies in a space so that they can get on to the action. But the way that banter is built, relationships are formed, there's a lived-in quality almost immediately to meeting the crew of the Nostromo. And that means that you get a wonderful sense of disruption when the new element falls into place. The new element, of course, being extremely dangerous and deadly to almost everybody on board. But you want, when you are writing, sometimes we writers would love to just rush on to the exciting parts. We're so excited to tell our story. But we have to consider the benefit of writing a story that feels like it's already in progress before the events that we are going to be adding to it. These are people who have their own motivations, they have internal momentum, they have their own issues, their own bugbears, their own dreams. And if you can create those intimations, you create that lived-in feel, suddenly your audience is going to care when those elements have been disrupted, not just by horror, but by anything new that comes along. Someone has had their life path, and then for whatever reason, good or bad, it has been changed by the events in your narrative. That creates a lot of tension, that creates a lot of investment in character, so very useful. So on top of that, suspense is built through patience, extremely important. And again, a lot of films more recently, in the horror genre, we had a window where everything was about jump scares, and because CGI was still so exciting for a little while, everyone just wanted to show what they could do with these dramatic visuals. And for a period, there was a little bit less focus on the building of suspense and tension. And a really key element for horror especially, and this is a science fiction horror film, is the knowledge, which the director has to have, the writer has to have, that whatever we see is never as terrifying as what we are afraid we might see. And so those moments of uncertainty, if you can hold in them, you really don't need much CGI work. Alien has some of the most phenomenal shots where you do not see the alien. You see the vulnerability of someone moving through a space, not sure if an alien is there. Beautiful scene with Harry Dean Stanton, wet dripping chains in one room, which is already heated and musty. So it's just, there's a sense of discomfort in the atmosphere. It's tangible. And something terrible happens to our poor fellow, and we don't necessarily see it except through the eyes of the cat on board. Well, not even through the eyes. We're watching the cat, watching the scene. And those are wonderful moments. What made Alien so powerful? There's an outtake where you can see the alien in the human suit, and I'm really glad it's an outtake because it allows you to dwell on the creature too much so that it becomes knowable. You can see the human in it. Oh, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But the film is so good at living in shadow and living in the corners of one's eyes and one's imagination. And that's what you need to do with your readers or your viewers, is trust them. And not just to fill in the blanks, but to be able to fill in the fear. They don't need to see every horrific detail. You want to save those moments. You want to make them sparing so that the power of them is amplified by everything that the character brings to them. So that's something that Alien does exceptionally well. Relatedly, in terms of the staging, it's quite minimalist in general, so we are able to focus on just a few aesthetic objects and everything that is present is used. This comes back to the use of setting. So the ship is a character, and we have established, well, not we, I didn't make this wonderful film, but the film has established a body of settings which are then employed. And you don't have to be so pat that every single part of the ship needs to be used, but there is this elegance to creating a world in which things have an everyday use, which is then transformed later in the film. And it's not just science fiction films and horror films that do this. If you want another really good character study, Die Hard. Die Hard is a perfect film. It uses every aspect of its setting, and you really have inventive challenges that are presented by the tower in which this entire conflict is taking place. So I guess I should be advocating, now that we know that Die Hard is a Christmas film, that Die Hard is also a science fiction film, obviously, because it really brings its location to life, right? A little bit. But these kinds of films are special. The ones that have a setting, choose a setting, and make full use of the setting really come to life and have tremendous value on rewatch. Okay, oh yeah, last one, really important one, is that Alien has characters making coherent mistakes. This is going to be extremely important as we contrast this with the other film. Humans are flawed and will always make mistakes. We often, when we watch horror films, we're shouting like, don't go down there alone, that's ridiculous, that's so stupid. And then we watch the pandemic unfold, and we saw a lot of people make really, really bad choices without anywhere near as much pressure upon them in the course of it. So I think a lot of us are watching zombie films very differently these days after having lived through the first waves of pandemic. But Alien has characters who make coherent mistakes. And what do I mean by coherent mistakes? Again, we were introduced to real characters. They have motivations, they have drives, they have different aptitudes. And the mistakes that they make should follow from these things. The same way that you or I don't know who you are specifically, but we are probably going to fall into error in different ways based on our habituated training and our exposure to the world. So our habituated responses are going to make us not imperfect in distinct ways that are wonderful for narrative, but sometimes films don't care. They don't care about thinking through the character. What would the character actually do in that circumstance? And so they will have errors. They're forced errors. They're errors that aren't arriving from the character, but from the necessity of the story. And this is an extension of a concept known to writers as the MacGuffin. So keep the MacGuffin in mind. The MacGuffin is a device or an object that exists solely, or in some cases it is these little tiny plot turns that can also be a device, that exists solely because the plot needs them to exist. The character did this because it's the author needed to get from point A to point C, and this B was the only way to do it. It's lazy writing, unless you're doing it for comic effect. Sometimes films and books will rely on the fact that, life can sometimes feel like a MacGuffin. But you don't want to, as a writer, suggest impatience. And so again, if you avoid the initial character work of building people who have their own inner drives, if you ignore building a coherent physics engine of the universe because you're just such in a rush to get to the exciting parts, you're going to, in the process, overlook what makes those big flashy displays, those really intense moments worthwhile. Because if we were just to cut into certain points in most any film, the most intense ones, the most exciting visuals and so forth, they will not have the same effect as if we had been there for the entire journey. And that entire journey requires an understanding of coherent characters, flawed and all, and really well thought out settings, and a patience also with allowing things to unfold. Oh, I had one more note about that patience, which is really important. Alien works as well because it develops a xenomorph, and I'm going to go into a little bugbear right here. The xenomorph species in Alien is one of many, but it has now been taken in our culture as the xenomorph, and so people think any xenomorph must be the species from Alien. Xenomorph is just a general term. Xeno, alien, strange, morph, form. And so it is used in the universe as a code for any kind of alien life forms that people come across. Of them, we have one xenomorph species, which happens to be really dangerous. But in Alien, there's a lot of patience, there's a lot of trust in the viewer, and so the alien species has a coherent life cycle, very important as we think about other films. And so you do get to learn this species as you go, which is also extremely important to developing a sense of suspense and coherent world building. Other folks will, as we get to, not be as interested in this. But it's one of the things that makes Alien and Aliens so powerful, is that we have a very coherent sense of species design, the life cycle, which allows us to build a sense of expectations as we're moving along. And these expectations are not going to be destroyed in any kind of cheap gotcha manner. They are going to be built upon in a way that allows you to feel like you are learning the world. And it really brings the reader in, or the viewer in. So now that I've set up what makes Alien work so well, besides, of course, Sigourney Weaver and her scanties, but that's another podcast or another video cast. We're going to skip over to Prometheus. Now, as I said, I did not like Prometheus as an alien film. I don't think it is an alien film. I think it is a film in which Ridley Scott later on wanted to play out a lot of ideas. And that's great. Big dramatic director who does envision things in the abstract. I think Ridley Scott always needs somebody to sort of rein him in, bring him back. Prometheus and Covenant were more focused on big ideas around the origin of humanity. And so they fixate on the idea of the creation of the engineers, a species that creates the aliens. And there's a lot about an approach to key concepts within the religious realm, and specifically, not even just Abrahamic faiths, very specifically Christianity. There's a lot of Christianity built into this. Now, when I said that I rewrote the screenplay, fanfics, in 3 days after watching it, it wasn't because of the religion in it. I'm atheist. I love the idea of having an element or a piece in this franchise that explores religiosity, questions of value, questions of human purpose and evolutionary design in light of many different people's belief sets. I just thought it was really poorly done in that light on many different levels. I thought that the character was extremely flattened and stereotypical, although the first draft was even worse. I went back and looked at the first screenplay, and it had a heavy-handed opening. It starts with a reading of Genesis. The main character's father is preaching, and then he's taken away dramatically by the corporation, so setting up this trauma story around religious persecution. Just a whole other level of bad. But, so they did improve. They improved on the original. But they still, I mean, some people have been very pejorative about this. The film does focus on, quote-unquote, space Jesus. I don't mean to be downplaying it or reducing it, but they created a story where engineers created life on Earth as well. And unfortunately, one engineer might have been Christ. We might have killed Christ, got engineers really angry, and so they sent bioweapons off to try to destroy us, but they got waylaid along the way, and so they got killed instead. And then a few 2,000 years or so later, our species goes out into space. And that's another reason it's so hackneyed. The turn where you realize that context comes from a date of saying, oh, this happened 2,000 years ago, very loosely, which is unrealistic. There's a lot of problems in terms of date stamping across galaxies. And also, this is supposed to be happening in the future. It's not happening in this century. We're not quite there with space travel. So it really strains credulity on a number of gimmicky plot point levels. And then the heavy-handedness of trying to make this all a very, very harsh fit, very rough fit with the Jesus narrative, when there are so many other ways that one could go about introducing religiosity. And I say this also as someone who's read quite a bit of science fiction that has religiosity in it, and which explores religious questions seriously and carefully. If you haven't read The Sparrow, I highly recommend it. I'll even put it in the show notes, because there are beautiful tensions that can come out of this kind of exploration. But I personally felt it didn't come out there because that wasn't the point. So, long way of saying, Ridley Scott was interested in something else. He was not. The aliens in this film are a side effect. there's tangential to the main core of why these films were produced. And that really shows in the development of the franchise. So first and foremost, as I said, some set pieces, okay. Scott's beautiful on visuals. There are still some elements of Prometheus that I adore on a visual level. There's one beautiful use of the time recording device, and the way Scott has decided to portray it is just wonderful, evocative, and something useful for science fiction writers when thinking about how to create future tech that doesn't feel human. Very neat. But it was more around the android David, who's this caretaker of the ship, which is in transit in a long journey to find the origin of human life, following a sort of treasure hunt of a map. And we spend a lot of our time with David, and we're contemplating him as a created object before we move into other created objects, thinking about humanity as a created object in light of the other objects. So again, really potent stuff, using the core elements of the original series, the creation of androids, the creation of humans, the creation of aliens, all could have been done in a really beautiful way. Instead, we have characters who are not necessarily fully fleshed out. They are often quite flattened. But on top of that, in terms of their own motivations, they do not make coherent mistakes. They make mistakes that are MacGuffins, and it is painful. It's not to say that little things don't go wrong, but I think everybody criticized this film for the cheap, easy win of the characters landing on an alien world and taking off their helmets. In the first film, a face hugger, one of the smaller aliens, attacks and takes over one of the crew through his helmet. And inside the novelization, there's a little bit more of an explanation of exactly how that happens through some of the acid that is stored in the alien creature. And so it wasn't necessary to take off the helmet in order to achieve the effect necessary. But these kinds of careless choices and tripping into a pond after, they undermine our interest in the characters. That's really what they do. We're no longer as interested in what happens to a whole bunch of haphazard characters who don't even know what they're doing and don't seem to have coherent reasons for not knowing what they're doing. If you're going to have a character who freaks out at certain scenarios, code for it so that we can get a sense of, okay, this is a character who freaks out, but somehow they're still on the ship. They've gotten this far in life for some reason. But that didn't happen here. And so what it shows to the viewer is that the writer doesn't care. They are just trying to use these pieces to get to an end result. And you get that as well in the Alien. As I said, the aliens are not really important to this species, to this movie, to Prometheus or to Covenant. And that comes up very clearly in the fact that something is added, another MacGuffin, the black goo. It's this primordial substance that creates life. And what it does is it completely screws with all of the careful development of species design that was laid out in Alien and Aliens, and the others as well. Alien 3 is everyone's. We really want to care more about it. It has such a fraught history of its development. And then the fourth one, Alien Resurrection, is kind of a goofy return of certain beloved characters. It has its own problems too, but even it develops the species design and the attributes of the species, what it can be used for in terms of research purposes, in a coherent way. Prometheus comes along and just throws all of that out the window because it has created the black goo of creation. And anything can happen when the black goo infects you, which means that all kinds of coherent life cycles for the alien are thrown out the window. You can have spores and different forms of infestation in any way, shape, or form. Timelines are thrown out. That's key in Alien as well, is that the species has very clear phases of development, and it takes time to develop, just like any real creature, but not so much in this. Acceleration happens when necessary for the plot. And so again, it can be very frustrating to watch a film like that. One has to remember Scott wasn't really making an alien film here. He wanted to play out other ideas, grand ideas, and these alien elements just became some of the useful backdrop, even if it means throwing them out the window. So this is the context in which this film comes out. Federico Álvarez, or Fede as he's often known, has a lot of horror cred. He is the director of Don't Breathe 2, Evil Dead, one of the more recent films, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the 2022 edition. And so he has a lot of good chops. I think a lot of people are excited to see if he's going to do a video game adaptation called Dark Space. I think he would be, or Dead Space. Dead Souls. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'll put back in the show notes, though, the words that I'm blanking on in the middle of a production. Always embarrassing when that happens. I have played this game. There's a very scary video game, and it was game-changing in terms of its design. Imagine a lot of video games before that point would have you moving through scary spaces, and you would be killing things as you went, and then everything would be inert, like your setting would just be. But that video game was really special in as much as when you killed something, it didn't stop existing as an object with a life, with a presence in the space. You could trip over limbs, you could trip over things. Things would move sometimes around you, and just added to the overall atmosphere. So the point is, and I'm very ashamed that I'm forgetting the name, but it'll go into the show notes, is that this director would be wonderful for that, because he's very good at recognizing space and using space, which is perfect for an alien film. One other thing I want to say about his background, though, he's Uruguayan, and although he hasn't actually done any Spanish language features that I can think of, I don't recall, I might be in error with that, I want to say something about Spanish language horror films in general. Spanish language and French as well. Non-Western horror sometimes does things differently. And a lot of my experience of watching films from a Latin American or a Spanish context is there's a lot more comfort with body horror in many ways that I don't know what it is. Is it our Protestant overarching tone in North America? We're just a little bit more squeamish around. But you'll find a lot more fetuses dead, and fetus ghosts and horror of that nature. You'll find a lot of more children dying. You'll find wounds. The imagery for women is definitely a lot more visceral sometimes. And so it's no surprise that in this piece as well, you get a lot of female-coded imagery. And I didn't mention it explicitly for Alien because it only really comes out in Aliens, but the female discourse or female vocabulary is a huge part of the franchise. In the first one, Ripley is just Ripley. Ripley survives, she and Jonesy. And it's not really about woman power or anything to that effect, although it was very refreshing as a film to have that as an outcome. But Aliens really upped the game in terms of reflecting on motherhood, specifically in certain ways, or that sort of protective family nature. But it was done in a subtle way. Not subtle, I'm not going to say subtle, because there are some very clear overlaps. It was done in a way that didn't come across as corny. It was just holding in tension this queen, alien queen, protecting their brood, and this feminized character protecting a small child. And so you have these lovely contrasts built out in the storyline. In this one as well, Alien Romulus, you're going to see vulvas. I mean, they're very, very vulva-oriented images in relation to the aliens, and that makes a lot of sense with species design. There's even one scene that I would count as an homage to the whole horror of vagina dentata. So go in prepared. And it does have, there is something that involves a fetus in a gestation cycle that goes back to Prometheus as well. Álvarez is somebody who knows his history, and in this piece, Alien Romulus, he brings all of that to bear. So I guess now we can finally get into Alien Romulus. But I just wanted to say that there are some people who maybe think, oh, Álvarez is just going for shock value by, adding in all of this very icky vulva imagery or whatever, or icky is not icky. You know what I mean. I'm just talking about the sort of kind of prudish Protestant waspy context that sometimes means that we don't play as much with female body horror, at least not to the extent of French language film or Spanish film, but I want to say that it's extremely normative to many other horror cultures. Sometimes Japanese? Yeah, I don't know. There's something odd about our horror culture. We have hard limits on what is acceptable and what starts to become beyond the pale. You know what that's like. Sometimes people will watch a horror film and they're okay with the whole family dying just so long as nothing happens to the dog. So we have very strange particular preferences. Okay, so all of that is the backstory. We have Alien with its establishment of a lot of world building. We have Prometheus and Covenant, which are not really alien films because they're not really interested in that species design or in the kind of character work that was done in the first few films. They have another aim entirely, which is to focus on these big grand questions, and they don't care what they do to the canon to reach that result. So what happens when you have a director taking on this franchise and wants to demonstrate a competent, not even competent, just a way to move forward with the franchise that pays homage to everything that came before? You get a film like Alien Romulus. You get a film that first and foremost is declaring itself as a return to form. That is its point. It's to demonstrate, look, we still know how to make one of these older types of films, and we care to do that. Very important promise before the series as well. It focuses on the retrofuturist angle, so again, there's a lot of focus on the objects. The material culture of this film is very important. It focuses on a lot of the same themes that were extremely important to the original. We have a working class cast, which is just the same as we had for Alien. Every film, and even a couple of video games at least that I could note from the Alien series, has a moment of homage in this piece. They're all blended in, but how they're blended in is really important, because Álvarez does work that helps to mediate the derailment in some ways of Prometheus and Covenant into something else. A lot of people are upset. I've seen in some reviews that he brought in the black goo at all, but in terms of timeline, Prometheus happens well before the events of Alien, so it's canon, and yet the way that Álvarez deals with it is interesting. We'll do that in the spoiler section. But first, we are introduced to a working class crew, and they have their own motivations. They have their own reasons for being where they are that are not contingent on anything related to what is going to disrupt them. They are going from a planet where they are essentially in indentured servitude, no hope of getting transport permits, no hope of being able to get out. They are just stuck with Wayland, the corporation, forever. And then they note there's some debris of this research station. At first they think it's the ship, but it's a whole station. Called the Renaissance, which is split into two halves, Romulus and Remus. So you have two divisions, a very evocative and interesting setting, and they're going to go to it on their shuttle, their ship, which is used in a mining context and thus has many gritty mining components into its structure, which are going to be important for later scenes. Again, the establishing of very coherent spaces for future action. And these characters have their own tensions amongst themselves. They have their own dreams of using the cryo chambers that are available, the cryopods on the station, to be able to leave on their own, because they have a ship. They just can't go to another planet without these the cryo fuel and the cryopods to be able to survive the 9-year journey. So if they can get that, they can get out. They have their own core motivation, and then they happen to accidentally run into a really bad xenomorph species that kind of derails everything. The cinematography also is just gorgeous. This has been a phenomenal year for science fiction on a visual level. So Álvarez has focused a lot on dark and light spaces, and the funny thing, the really fascinating piece that I took out of it is that through this use of light and shadow, he's actually created gray spaces morally, because you have the idea of an early scene with a ship that is going to extract something from the Nostromo, or not from the wreckage around the Nostromo, and we know what is that it's going to extract. And so there's darkness associated with this alien species, but there's also darkness associated with the ship that is taking it. So there's this fluidity of which is the menace, because we always fear the things that have shadow cast over them, and yet it's both the corporation and the alien specimen that they pick up. And that beautiful synthesis, that beautiful tension between light and dark, and the gradations of moral crises that happen between them are key to the themes. They are represented in the visuals beautifully. He also, like with the original film, focuses on those moments of patience and minimalism. One of the best scenes in the film is the most terrifying scenes involves little more than light play and shadow for a woman terrified, clinging to the grates in this room where she's not sure if the alien is going to attack her or not. And just being with her in that moment is just like the Harry Dean Stanton moment earlier in Alien. It doesn't require you necessarily to see the monster. Just something looming, just the concept is enough. And so there's a lot of patience and respect for the viewer built into that. So the set piece is also, again, everything that we encounter is going to be used. And you might not, like, even little things that you might not notice, they are presented earlier so that later they can have their function. And yet here's the other really important tie-in in terms of what makes this an extraordinarily controlled production. There are homages to every film, and there are a couple places where I think they went too far. There's one place where a full line is said, just cut off the last half of the line so we have a hint of a reference. The rest of it is just playing to the fans. But when it comes to the characters, there is such fealty to what they would know in their context. So, we have lots of famous scenes from the Alien franchise. Flamethrowers especially are really important to certain elements. But flamethrowers don't really matter here because the characters are encountering the species for the first time and they're learning as they're going. Through that, they make their own interesting guesses. They figure out a way to take care of a face hugger based on the fact that they first unleashed these monsters. Monsters is a cruel word. This alien specimens by raising the temperature. Before then they were frozen, so they just intuit, well, we guess we need to use ice. We need to use cold. But they've had nothing in their experience set to suggest that flame would also work. And so it doesn't really come up. Acid does. And electricity, but the framework of learning from their environment shows respect for the characters, respect for their perception of the world. That also comes up in the way that they make mistakes. We've gone back to the original of making coherent mistakes and tying coherent mistakes into the through line of the film in terms of its thematic core, because we do have an android here too. And I'm not going to tell you which because we're still in the spoiler-free section, but the android does have to make some important choices, and others around them have to wrestle with the fact that androids make these choices for humans. And there's a lot of animosity and tension. How dare an android make a choice? And yet the choices the androids are supposed to be making are to value more life, protect the numbers of people over individuals, which is a really unfortunate choice that a lot of humans have to make too. But when it's an android, it's easier to be angrier because they're not humans, so they don't necessarily have the same skin in the game. Literally, their skin's a little different. But for this reason, it's interesting that the mistakes that are made by the characters all come from a selfish need to survive, a desire to survive in the moment. Their panic comes from their emotions that are tied into caring about someone and not caring about the probabilities at all. They make mistakes, huge mistakes, and you can see why each one is made. And that is extremely important to creating a more compelling storyline. Okay. Yeah, it comes from having that as a priority in the film. Again, Prometheus and Covenant, I think Scott really wanted to think on such abstract terms that it didn't matter as much whether the individual characters had their own coherence necessarily, except for David, the android there. And so that means that the choices that are made really do get to fit into the larger piece about the androids, which is where we're going to come. Almost. We have one more thing to say in the spoiler-free section, and then we'll move on to the spoiler section. The homages that are played come back to that question of tropes that I was talking about. And some people are like, oh, we've seen this all before. All they're doing is like rehashing the classics. And I mean, this is a complaint that's gone back to things like, oh, Star Wars is just riffing off of old Japanese films and old Western films. And there's this fascinating issue that a lot of viewers have sometimes. They don't recognize how contemporary their complaints are. If it is an old fairy tale, if it's an old religious structure, if it's an old myth cycle, we are excited to see, oh yeah, they're referencing this great classic. But when we are building our own myth cycles today and we're building our own narrative tropes today, sometimes we get affronted. How dare they just did this? I saw this in another film. But when you embrace what the trope is, when you embrace the idea that a franchise or a universe for science fiction or other genres as well is trying to establish a vocabulary, what it's doing is it's giving you the tools with which to manage that balance between the familiar, something you expect, something that is knowable, something you anticipate, and variation, those pleasing variations on theme, which is exactly what happens here with the vast majority of the homages. As I've said, there are a couple lines where it's like cut off a little tiny piece, don't be quite so heavy-handed. But when it comes to the use of certain visuals, things from Alien Resurrection and from Prometheus and Covenant, in certain cases, you have a sense of, oh, I've seen this before, but now knowing that, you have a set of expectations around the object, around the device, around this trope, and now you look to see how is it dealt with differently here? What are the variations? And I think that there are distinct variations in this piece, even though there are some wonderful resonance points. A good resonance point, a good example, is that in the first Alien film, there's an important scene where she has to get the ship to self-destruct with the alien on board. And there's a procedure she has to go through. There's a certain number of knobs that need to be dealt with as a safety protocol. And when you come to Alien Romulus, there's a point where for separation to happen, a certain number of knobs, a certain procedure needs to be done with the retrofuturist design of the ship. So that's something, it's a nod to the original, but it's a different context. It's not necessarily an explosion. And it has a different formulation in terms of the way that these things are set up. The apparatus that this character needs to deal with is set up in a very different format, and yet with just enough of a nod to the original that you see, okay, so you can see the beat, and you can see how the beat is playing out differently. And it does. It does have different consequences. Okay. Let's move into the spoilers as our final section. So we have in this film an android character, Andy. And I was a little bit I had mixed feelings at first. I was chewing over this, and I love the fact that it was chewing over this because it means it was good character design. At first, we don't know that Andy is an android. At first, we watch and you think, oh, we might have an autistic character in this film. It's not an autistic character. It is an android who happens to have been damaged along the way and not functioning quite the way that they would have in their prime, but they're also an older model. And Andy has been essentially given one task to take care of Rain, who is our protagonist. And that is because their parents, quote unquote, because Rain sees Andy as a brother, died in the mines in this horrific planet that Rain can't get off, and Andy is just supposed to take care of her. That's his job. But in this series, in this film, we have a Flowers for Algernon plot, which is really interesting. So again, when people say, oh, this film didn't do anything, this film didn't add anything, it's like, what are you watching? I think that they're conflating the idea that this film has tropes that are familiar to the franchise with the idea that nothing new has been accomplished. But our android has a Flowers for Algernon subplot. And I don't know if everybody here knows that reference. It's classic. The original story involved a person who happened to have a quote-unquote low IQ. Well, not quote-unquote. In the context of the time, IQ was used as a measure of aptitude. And yet they went into, and they had a good life. They loved their job. They loved their friends. They loved people around them. They loved the center where they went to do a little bit of learning. And then they were chosen for an experiment, which gave them a serum, which boosted their intelligence. And suddenly they realized that their friends were always making fun of them, that their job was actually kind of menial, and that they were really quite lonely in their life, and that there was more that they could have now that they are being seen as more on par with people around them. And then the serum starts to fail, and they regress to the other state with the knowledge that they gained. So before they were happy, and then the question is, can they be happy again after learning how other people viewed them and how limited their life was? That's the question of the story. This android has been vastly diminished for quite some time, and in the course of this film, we'll get an upgrade that makes him dangerous to the rest of the crew by their understanding of androids being dangerous, because androids can make decisions that humans in their emotional panic might not. So he becomes seen very much as an enemy, and he does have a different protocol which takes over, the protocol of helping the company. So for a while, there's a lot of animosity, tension, and yet at the end, our character chooses to go back to save her brother, because that's in her irrational behavior, in her emotionality, that is who he is, even though his cold android logic would say, no, it's just a machine, leave it behind. She goes back, but to save him, she has to take out the disk that has provided all of these upgrades, and Andy has to let her do that. So then the question is, how do you do this so it's not saccharine, so that it's not done in such a way that Andy loses all cohesion as a character, and it's done logically. It is done in a way that makes sense for the character to accede in that moment and allow Rain to take out a chip that is giving him a new directive and new intelligence and new improvements to his system. So tremendous, tremendous work in that plot line. And again, around it, the coherent mistakes of all the humans are used to flesh out a really interesting discourse about moral decision making, about the quote-unquote cold equations of space. And that's something that Romulus does quite distinctly. It is something that allows the film to have its own very clear core center in terms of a momentum for the characters outside of their engagement with the aliens. And then we get to the last part, which is the MacGuffin, or maybe I should just call it the Mac-Goo-fin, because it's the goo that everyone was so frustrated about. Álvarez had to synthesize all of this canon, but that doesn't mean that he had to leave it open-ended, and he didn't. And I don't think people are giving him enough credit for that for this film, is that he includes on the station, they find that there was an experiment, or a set of experiments being done using the specimen that was taken from the Nostromo's wreckage, and they have been using it to synthesize this goo, which causes all kinds of mayhem for us as well, for the characters, for coherently mistaken choices that they make along the way lead to some really difficult end results. Oh yeah, we're in the spoiler section. So we have one character who's told very cautiously, don't take the goo, I don't trust it, it's not safe, but she's in pain, she's really hurt, she wants to protect herself and her baby, so she takes the risk, and then she and her baby get it because of that. She's pregnant in the film. And so we have that lovely pregnancy horror component at the end. But what's done with that goo both acknowledges its existence in the series and also is separated from the rest of the coherent world building around alien design that holds for the rest. Now, Álvarez still does one thing, unfortunately, really, really unfortunately, because Alien was really good on patience and allowing the species to grow normally, but Álvarez has kept the expedited timelines for the different phases in alien development that we get from Prometheus and Covenant. However, again, he does separate the two. We have classic alien development structures, and then the components with the black goo are done separately. They have their own wild outcomes, but they are also tied up in such a way that the film ends with the invitation, the goo can stop here. We've dealt with it. Here are the specimens, here are the samples from those earlier pieces, but there's no sign of them going forward. There's no sign of them just lingering out there. So the station gets destroyed, the ship gets away with its valiant little survivors, but there's no sense of the goo ending up in the wrong hands at the end. So we have this cordoned off component of really bad world building, which is allowed to have its arc within this film and come to a close if future creators so desire. I don't know. I imagine that the new Alien series will have to pay homage to the Black Goo somewhere, but I think Álvarez has done the best job possible in terms of having these elements, but compartmentalizing them so that there can be coherent world building in terms of setting, character, species design, all of that. Which I think brings us to the end of what I wanted to say, and I managed to keep it hopefully under an hour. I was really worried I was going to go forever on that Prometheus section. And again, I'm hugely embarrassed that I'm still blanking on this name. Dead Space? Oh my goodness, I'll put that in the show notes. But let's wrap up. No one film is going to serve everybody, but I've been really fascinated by the discussion around this film, in part because this whole series has had some huge turns And a lot of us were very much disaffected with it during the turns to Prometheus and Covenant because they didn't feel like Alien films. They felt like something else. Alien versus Predator, at least those franchise pieces were hokey and goofy, but we knew what they were doing and how they were serving. But it was nice to go back to a film that really wanted to show an audience that the craft is still there and the narrative vocabulary of the franchise is still there. This is something that I think all writers can definitely benefit from, whether you're writing science fiction, horror, action, or whatever, is really just imagining what kind of physics engine do you want your readers to experience when they are reading your work? What kind of expectations do you want to set for them? And you have to be mindful that every detail you introduce is going to be setting expectations. You also need to recognize that if you introduce things, there's going to be an expectation among some readers that those elements go somewhere. They don't necessarily have to. There are different schools of thought about this, but you are certainly setting an expectation. So be mindful of the fact that the expectation exists. But on a bigger level, when it comes to the question of the vocabulary that you're building, I would highly recommend taking a page from Álvarez's book and not being afraid of tropes. Not being afraid of doing something that quote-unquote everyone has done a million times before. That is the way narrative works. That's the way literature works. We pay homage to what's come before. We are always invoking the familiar. And we are invoking the familiar to create tension through variation. And your variation is going to be wonderful, I'm sure. It probably already is. Many of the people who are listening to this must already have written something. I don't imagine that this is going to fall into the hands of a random reader who's never dabbled entirely in the creative process. But really own the fact that you are building a language for yourself, for your universe, for your readers, and it is not a weakness in the text if you go back to that well. The question is just, now that you have it, how can you use reviewers' or readers' expectations of that well of vocabulary to take them somewhere new and interesting and tell other stories? I leave that in your hands. Thank you for sitting with me for an hour of wandering through this wonderful franchise. I'm sure that I'm actually going to be watching Alien Romulus again, certainly before rewatches of most of the others in the franchise. So if you do get a chance to see it, I recommend it for a craft perspective, from a visual perspective, and maybe just for a few thrills along the way. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. As always, liking and subscribing is something that helps with algorithms to get YouTube to a point where it can be more useful for this the actual creator. So for those of you who have liked and subscribed in the past, thank you so very much. You're helping me move as a tiny cog through a giant machine. And otherwise, much obliged to you all for spending any of your time with these long pieces. Cheers.